Hello and welcome. This is the bitsvsbytes podcast. I'm your host, I'm Grigic, and today with me is Jussi Liokkonen. He is the director for space and new technologies at Reaktor. So welcome, Jussi.
Thank you, Amir.
What I would like to get into first is a little bit about your background. So could you tell a little bit about that and also how you got to work at Reaktor?
Sure. A key part of my identity is, of course, that I'm a father of two Girl Scouts, but my professional background is being a systems engineer. I've been working on secure and fault-tolerant systems for about 25 years now in one way or another. I'm an old open source advocate and kernel hacker as well.
Oh, cool.
I was originally hired from school to Nokia Networks, but the bureaucracy got better of me quite soon. So I established my own consultancy company that I ran for over a decade. Then I sold the business to a bigger company, and I was then the CTO in that company for about 3 years. But then the opportunity presented to join Reaktor, and I kind of grabbed it. Because Reaktor had a reputation of being a really innovative company with super talented people. And that was now 7 years ago, and it feels like I just started yesterday.
And what made you make that step? Because when a lot of people start their own company, they tend to keep that going and keep in that role and not go work for another company anymore. So what was the reasoning behind that?
There were two distinct steps with distinct reasons, and when I decided to sell my own company was when my first child was being born. I just wanted to free up more of my time to stay at home with the kids when they were young.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Running your own company is just not a 9 to 5 job.
Job.
Yeah, it takes up all your time in every kind of way. So, could you explain a little bit about what Reaktor does?
Reaktor is a consultancy and a design agency. We help our customers to create new business with digital solutions. In practice, this means business consultancy, and then we help our customers to develop digital services and products. We're very group, and for us, success kind of means that money starts to flow to our customers' bank accounts, and preferably in a way that also makes the world a bit better place to live in.
And you are based in Finland, right?
We're originally from Finland, and that's where our headquarters are in Helsinki. But over the years, we've expanded quite a bit, and we have offices in New York in the US, in Amsterdam, Netherlands, then in Tokyo in Japan, and Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and also a fresh office in Stockholm and Sweden.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's pretty much a global company right now. That's also the way we got linked up. I saw a post on LinkedIn about you talking about what you were doing with space and space ventures. And I would like to get into that a little bit because, as you said, Reaktor is you do all kinds of business consultancy, but also are an agency. And then I saw some things about some ventures into space. So how did that come about?
That, of course, is the next step in our globalization endeavors. Now, all kidding aside, there are no customers in space yet.
Yeah.
But being a consultancy, our customers expect us to bring in the latest and greatest tools and methods. And this is why we spend quite a lot of effort to understand what's the next big thing in tech that could benefit our customers. And one of the things that we were tracking was the space industry. With SpaceX, Blue Origin, and the rapidly maturing small satellite scene, we saw that there is a bit of a revolution brewing. And it was interesting to think what that could enable for our customers. And then we started to get contacts from our customers, especially in the aviation and marine sectors. asking that could we solve certain use cases for them that we realized this will require space assets to implement. So we kind of had both a breakpoint in technology, and we saw initial business demand for what that new technology could potentially enable. So you can kind of see how a consultancy and agency who wants to be able to bring the best possible solutions to their customers would delve into this scene and start to learn how to actually build space-based services and solutions.
So what kind of challenges did those clients present? So what were they asking from you in a use case sense?
In order of client confidentiality, I'll talk in generalities. I hope
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
okay.
Yeah, sure.
But the kind of needs, basically, one thing to understand is that space is a tool to scale. If for example, you need to be able to communicate over a wide area or collect data from large areas, then you need a very high-flying platform to cover wide areas. And the kind of use cases that we were approached related to, for example, asset tracking or being able to provide telemetry information from remote machinery from places where there is no existing connectivity, and it would be extremely expensive to build any kind of connectivity. And also kind of use cases where you want to monitor areas around the planet very frequently without having to install physical infrastructure into those target areas.
Yeah, exactly. So things that I'm thinking about would be like remote areas where you just can't get connectivity to, right? So somewhere in the middle of the ocean, for example.
Yeah, it's surprisingly difficult to extend the telecom network to the middle of the ocean.
Mm. So that's one of the things that you could get into, right?
Absolutely. That's one of the things. When you go to space, it allows you to cover large areas without the need of installing any on-ground infrastructure. And it is surprisingly, with this new space technology, it's cheaper to go through space than to go through very expensive ground infrastructure.
Yeah, that's crazy, because when you think about space and think about kind of the rockets that need to propel everything into space, you would say that that's really expensive.
Yeah.
But basically, it's less expensive than just building something in the ocean.
Yeah, and that's exactly the thing. What this huge breakpoint in technology we saw that is enabling. With SpaceX creating reusable rockets, they're able to drive down the cost of access to space quite significantly. Mm-hmm. And then with the advent of these very small satellites, also the cost of the spacecraft themselves are like 1/100th of what they used to be. Yeah. So whereas traditionally, if you wanted to have a small satellite, it would cost you in the order of $100 million. But now you can get one quite capable spacecraft for 1 million or even much less.
Yeah, that's an order of magnitude lower.
Zeros coming off the price, and that's significant.
Yeah. So what to get back to the way you started, because I can imagine when you start doing these kind of things or actually getting these kind of questions, you of course are starting to think about how can we do this. So how did you start? Because that seems for someone that I don't know enough about shooting something to space, but I can imagine that a lot of people don't. How do you like work together with other companies to get that working? How did that start?
Yeah, indeed. We started from the exact same point. We had no idea how to build a spacecraft or how to get that into space. So that was the baseline. We had a lot of science fiction aficionados, but that doesn't really work in the real world.
That doesn't count. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we obviously had no clue how to build an actual spacecraft, that's why we approached the local Aalto University, who had a satellite lab. And they had been developing these new kind of very small nanosatellites since 2010. And luckily, the team there was happy to help us. And in that process, they saw the business potential as well. And they decided to create a spin-off company. We funded them through our ventures arm, and we worked together with them to develop their Hello World mission platform, the spacecraft platform, the ground segment, the mission control systems. So the guys who came from the university satellite lab brought to the table their skills on actually building space hardware and knowing how to procure the launches and so forth. And we brought our understanding of the customer needs, the system design expertise, the software expertise, and together we were able to build something pretty neat.
Yeah. So to get into that, so how big are those satellites when you talk about nanosatellite?
When the satellite sizes are divided by weight, so between 1 and 10 kilograms, we're talking about nanosatellites.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think of 1 to few milk cartons. That's the size scale.
Yeah. So when you look at that, so you talked about that kind of Hello World thing. So I know that you did already send something into space, right?
Oh yeah, we've had the platform test spacecraft on orbit since last November, and it's been operating perfectly. It has exceeded pretty much all of our expectations on performance and stability. And that mission has two purposes. First is to be the test flight for the reusable platform, the kind of satellite bus that is very easy to use in different types of missions. And also it's a space qualification flight for a hyperspectral imager from VTT. It's the first of its kind in space, a miniature hyperspectral imager. It's a really cool device, but then that gets into the science department already. But and the satellite have been working really well.
So what does that do? So what can you actually do with that platform that you have right now? So you have one platform, but you also have that imager. So what does it actually provide right now?
Well, the imager is, of course, the interesting bit, or always in the space systems, the payload is the interesting bit because that is what enables some actual use case. The platform is just like in a car, you need the chassis, you need the wheels, you need the brakes, you need the engine for the car to be able to go anywhere. The satellite bus is kind of that infrastructure of the car. But the interesting bit is the payload, and the hyperspectral imager allows us to see chemical composition of the imaging target. This means that we can, for example, fly over Africa and we can determine the moisture levels of the farming experiments in the Sahara Desert.
Crazy.
And see that within few minutes here in Finland in our mission control.
Yeah. So how does that work? So how do you actually communicate with something that's hovering above the Earth? So, because a lot of people see the things on TV where, for example, NASA has some kind of satellite somewhere or a rover on Mars, and you're always like, okay, but how do they even communicate with such things? So how does that work in your case?
It works in most cases. It works in such a way that you have an antenna system somewhere on Earth. And when you are able to point that antenna system to your spacecraft, then you establish a radio communications link. And because the planet is rotating and the spacecraft are flying, often not synchronized to the planet's rotation, it means that you often have quite short communication windows where the antennas are aligned to each other.
So you can't connect with it the whole day around, right?
No, absolutely not. Especially when we are talking about these low-flying or low Earth orbit satellites, they need to be flying at 7.5 kilometers per second. that's about 27,000 kilometers per hour, in order to compensate for the gravitational pull of the planet. So they have to have this kind of centrifugal force. They have to have enough kinetic energy to not fall down. And that means that they are not flying around the planet, or they're not sticking in one place above the planet's surface. In fact, the spacecraft is flying around the planet in 93 minutes. And when it's flying over Finland, where we have our ground station, we have 10 to 11 minutes of time to communicate with the spacecraft, and then it goes beyond the radio horizon.
That's crazy, because sometimes people would say, yeah, you need to have full control. You need to be able to do everything, because everything moves so fast currently, right? Because I can send an email and in 1 second it will be at your doorstep, right? But in this case, it's totally different.
Yeah, that's why you have to have some level of autonomy on your spacecraft, because they are going to spend quite a bit of time beyond your radio link reach.
Yeah. Because what I was thinking about is, so all this kind of software to do these communications and stuff like that, is that kind of everything built from scratch, or are there things that are you can't call it off the shelf, I think, but how did you get into the process? So did you need to create all that yourself, or how did that go?
Well, for us, we are kind of crazy, and we need to build something by ourselves end to end, so that we understand how everything works in the pipeline. So we actually even physically built the antennas and the power amplifiers and wrote the software. We used SDR, or software-defined radio modules, that you can buy off the shelf, but you have to kind of program them yourself. So we used as much off the shelf stuff as we could, but we built the whole pipeline and had to do some welding and sawing and a lot of actual physical work to build the antenna solutions and so forth, in addition to the spacecraft.
What was that also? Because I can imagine when you are doing these kinds of things that you need to hire specific people for these jobs as well. How did that go? Because I can imagine that, for example, soldering and stuff like that. Those are things that are pretty much things that a lot of people can learn. But all these other stuff about the antennas and stuff like that, I can imagine that that's a little bit more specialistic, if you can call it like that.
Yeah, and of course it helped that the Space Lab team had some experience on this, but our approach was not to hire any specialists. Rather, we used our own seasoned experts who had been working previously in the automotive or aviation or robotics industries, and we specifically wanted to learn the space scene. So we did not hire any specific radio experts or space experts. We wanted to learn all this stuff. And that means that, for example, my team, we all had to pass the amateur radio exams and get all sorts of permits. And we spent quite a few nights and evenings studying MIT course materials on things like orbital dynamics and spacecraft systems engineering.
Yeah, that's interesting in so many ways, because normally you would say, okay, let's get the brightest people in the room that have all this information already and get them together. But you chose that different approach. So was that more because you had the feeling that it could also lead to different insights than people that are from a space industry, for example?
Absolutely. That was exactly the point, because we were seeing this change in the philosophy on how space technology is being built that enables the dramatic cost reduction. We figured that most likely we have something that we can bring into the field that nobody there yet knows quite how to do quite well. And in fact, when we think about the learnings from the project, it was quite clear that we had some surprises on the weird things related to operating in space, but also it was quite surprising for us how simple and kind of old technology was being used in the space environment. Things that we were using in the automotive industry like a decade ago, components that were really familiar to us. And we were able to introduce development methods and design practices and architectural design principles from other industries that were apparently not prevalent or at least widely known in the space side.
So what are some of those examples for those things that you did differently than what a normal space agency, for example, would do?
One of the key things was designing the system to be failure tolerant. So that's a fundamental design principle. Traditionally, space systems are designed to be like triple redundant everything so that they cannot fail. We, on the other hand, took the design approach that it's okay for any part of the system to fail. It knows how to recover and everything else can continue while that one part is rebooting. This is a similar approach than the SpaceX engineers take. So they also design failure-tolerant systems, and that allows them to use much cheaper components and development processes.
So how do you look at those kind of companies when we're talking about SpaceX? So are those companies that you, for example, in the future could work with, or are they competitors? How do you look at those?
We're definitely looking at SpaceX as a potential customer and also a service provider, because they are providing the cheapest, most versatile launches on the planet at this point.
Yeah, so you could, for example, see that as a platform where you could launch from, right? Use their rockets. Yes. Or something else.
Absolutely.
So getting into some of the more interesting things that you could do in space. So you've already done this Hello World. So what's the kind of next step in the whole process?
Well, there are two branches of the next steps. And one of the branches is the Space Lab, which, if you recall, spun off as a separate company. And they're currently working on 4 different spacecraft in different stages of building, like the Sunstorm for the European Space Agency or the W-Cube and so forth. And then there's the agency track, stuff that we're doing here at Reaktor Innovation side. At the innovation side, we focus more on helping our customers approach their business expansion by applying space technology. And then the Space Lab guys are more focused on actually building the bits and pieces needed to implement that.
Okay. So looking at it from a use case perspective, so what are some of the things that you see that could be a thing in the future, other than the things that you already have done before?
Well, one of the things that is going to happen within the next few years is the low Earth orbit telecommunication service. Mm-hmm. SpaceX, OneWeb, even Jeff Bezos is betting on that. So there are billions invested in these endeavors, and they're going to enable quite a lot of new kind of operations on the planet when they realize. And we're also working with industry companies involved in that game. So that's one area where we are clearly involved in, thanks to our insight into how to make these things very efficiently. Another thing that keeps popping up is precision agriculture, and that's going to need a wide area hyperspectral imaging solution that still isn't up in the sky today. So that's something that will definitely happen at some point. It's mostly a race of who gets there first.
Yeah, so those telecommunication satellites, if you can call them like that. So are those the things that they are talking about in the news right now for getting broadband into, for example, internet or broadband into remote areas?
Yeah, exactly. So SpaceX, Starlink, and OneWeb's constellation, and Jeff Bezos's Kuiper systems, and so forth.
Interesting. So there's one other thing that I was thinking about, because you hear all these kinds of things of a lot of satellites orbiting the Earth and a lot of space trash, if you can call it like that. So how do you think about that? Because say for instance this Hello World platform is done, it's run its course. How do you look at that? How do you solve those kind of problems?
Yeah, that's again, here we come to design principles. The Hello World is designed to be self-destructing. So it has designed in obsolescence mechanism. The spacecraft is specifically designed to not include any toxic chemicals or heavy metals. And that means that in about 9 years of its lifetime, it is going to re-enter the atmosphere, and being so small, it will burn completely to ash, leaving no bits and pieces behind. So when we have this low-flying spacecraft, we can utilize simple design principles to eliminate the junk problem. But for some use cases, we need to fly on higher orbits where you can't use these self-destruct mechanisms. You have to have specific deorbiting mechanisms. And I think it would be important for those to become mandatory somehow, because all the business potential that can be achieved via space-based services becomes impossible if the space junk problem becomes much worse than what it is today.
Yeah, and that's it's something that comes up in the news sometimes. Like there's so many satellites orbiting the Earth, and some of them just get decommissioned, and they're just still flying around, and nobody's doing anything with them. And I can imagine, especially with these new kind of companies coming up, that problem would be worse and worse if you don't get any regulations on those, right?
Absolutely, and it's kind of a challenge that there is effectively no regulation in space. Space is common, every man's land, and we have like the radio frequency regulation influencing how we can use radio communications that influence systems on the planet's surface. Then we have the aviation law that influences what we do from 0 to 100 kilometers up. But beyond the von Karman line, where space begins, there's only the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which basically just says that, hey, let's not break each other's toys. And that's all we have. Beyond that, it's a complete Wild West. Nobody has authority, and the international treaties are very, very light that exist.
Yeah, that could be a problem.
That could definitely be a problem. I see a clear need for international agreements on some kind of space traffic management. And that's something that's high on the agenda in the European Space Agency as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is not just one governing body's problem in that sense. It's all of us, right? I mean, if someone, I don't know, if in India or in China, which there are a lot of ventures into space from their sides as well. If they all should agree to that, right? It's one thing that should all, as you said, that treaty that's already there. Yeah, it is there, and probably they all follow that, but it's still not up until the level that you're going to get into now with all these extra satellites coming into play, right?
Exactly. That treaty was created to an era where you had basically two superpowers capable of sending maybe one satellite per 5 years. up there. And now every university and small company is able to send dozens of satellites up there. So it's a completely different dynamic.
So I also saw something about space as a service on your website, and I was wondering about what that actually meant.
Yeah, it's quite simple, actually. You see, beyond science and exploration, space is, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a tool to scale existing solutions, like getting those hyperspectral imagers to cover the whole planet. And companies and organizations, they are interested in outcomes and not in the operational details. Sorry. So the idea is that if you need like 24/7 hyperspectral imagery of, say, fisheries around the globe, then Spacelab offers you a turnkey service for just that. You just get the data stream and you don't need to worry about launch bookings or spacecraft operations or any of that.
Okay, so is that a little bit like the thing that AWS wants to do with ground station, or is that different from that?
It's very much the same thing, and we are taking the Amazon ground station service really happily, because that's something that will allow us to communicate with our spacecraft much better. If they have a widely distributed ground station network that we can just use, then it multiplies our communication windows to the spacecraft orbiting the planet.
Yeah, because you have more spaces in the world where you can communicate from, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's I think especially when you look at the internet, we already have these kind of cloud vendors where you could just take some resources from and use that. So it would be even easier for a lot of companies or universities or whatever to establish these kind of communications with satellites and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, and if we had the AWS ground station service back a few years ago, we probably wouldn't have built our own ground station at all. We would have just used the Amazon service, because that's what we do when we go to some of our customers and build their commercial services. If there's an existing Amazon or Azure service, we just use that if it makes sense. So that's what we would have done for the ground station as well, if that had existed back when we started.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, why reinvent the wheel if someone already has a good service for it to just use? So
absolutely,
how do you...
It was a clever play from Amazon, because I would imagine that most of these space-based services will collect and process their data in some kind of cloud environment. And if you're using Amazon ground stations, it makes sense to use Amazon cloud services as well for the actual implementation of the service backend.
Yeah. So they're ahead of the competition in that sense, where they already see this becoming an actual business where they could profit from.
Absolutely, yes.
So when we look at how using space is going to impact our use of technology, what do you see also happening? Some other things that are going to happen in the future. So really impacting the lives of just normal people on Earth.
I would say that you will see technology use becoming easier. We still have regional challenges. You have areas where you don't have mobile phone coverage. You have areas where you can't use modern technologies for, let's say, agriculture or other economic activities, because you don't have the connectivity, or you don't have up-to-date maps or up-to-date weather information and things like that. This low-cost space technology enables building better connectivity, building better situational awareness for automated systems especially. it's quite impossible to create like autonomous ships if you don't have connectivity to them, or if you can provide information about their surroundings to them. And these space-based systems enable us to solve those type of use cases. So I see both automation increase and the conveniences that we take for granted living in cities. Those conveniences will be available also in non-city areas.
Yeah, because that's something that a lot of people maybe even forget. I mean, we are linked up to satellites like the whole day, right? It's just something that you don't even think about. For example, if I turn on my GPS right now, or I open Apple Maps or Google Maps, whatever, you're communicating. You don't even feel that, but you're doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually half joked in some occasions that Pokemon Go is the ultimate space application, because you're using global maps that are produced from satellite data. You're using navigation from satellites. You are communicating over the cellular network, which is synchronized via satellites. And you're also seeing weather information that's produced by satellites.
Exactly. And that's the crazy part, is that this is the best way of actually using technology, right? Where you don't even notice it, but it does just work.
Yeah, that's exactly the point.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I hope those extra nano satellites and things that are going to be up there are going to provide, right? Where you use it for all kinds of things. Because, say for instance, everybody gets this option to do things in space, right? You see what happened when everybody got the option to create an app, to publish it to an app store and stuff like that. Imagine what can happen if you have that power in space, where you have that skill, as you said.
That's actually a really great analogy.
Yeah.
The power to create an app is now available for space. And I know that especially our Amsterdam office guys hate me for saying this, but I don't think space is very sexy or exotic. Because to me, it's just a tool, it's a means of scaling these services. It's machinery in the background.
Yeah, like you have servers on Earth.
That's the interesting part.
Yeah. The only interesting part is not on Earth. That's the only difference. But basically, yeah. Interesting, because that's something that I didn't think about before we started. But that's the ultimate goal for. I think it would be very cool to build something that's actually running in space. That blows my mind if you even think about that. But
well, we did that, and it's running there, and it's working really well. And now it's like, okay, so
it's not interesting anymore.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do, I wanted to ask you one more question, just to wrap up. So what are you most proud of since you started this whole venture?
Two things, really. One is the team at Reaktor. I just love the way that these highly experienced people throw themselves behind a fairly crazy idea and just very systematically, in a very goal-oriented way, start to grind away. What's the biggest assumption here, and then how do we validate that and work towards the end goal? And then you have something working in space. So I'm really proud of the team and that work ethic. And it's really like, I'm a fairly seasoned systems engineer, but I felt like a junior in that team. The other thing that I'm quite proud of is how well this was actually timed and how well this has been taken at the society level, because we were invited to contribute to creating the Finnish space legislation, the action program for the national space strategy and things like that. When we demonstrated that we have some new insight, we were invited into these processes. So I'm actually quite proud of the way that, at least in Finland, the government and the national organizations reacted to this change. It wasn't like, hey, you're now doing something fancy, new, high tech, go away, we don't want change, but rather how they embraced that, hey, you guys seem to understand what is changing and what does that mean. Please come and help us. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the cool thing, right? Where you can see the impact that you're having just by doing these kind of things. I'm blown away. I'm blown away, but that's more because this is just stuff that for a lot of people, of course, as you said, when you actually do this, you're like, okay, we sent up something up in space. It's still a big feat, but it kind of becomes ordinary, right? That's the thing. But for a lot of people.
Yeah, for us, it was primarily a validation that we have a hypothesis. If we do things in a certain way, if we bring our expertise at Reaktor that we have collected from different industries over the years, if we bring them to bear with this new space technology, it gives us a tool to scale services in the global scope. And yeah, we did that. So now we know that we can do that, and then moving on.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. So, where can people find more about this on the internet?
You should go to reaktorspace.com to find out more about the Hello World mission and the spacecraft that the Space Lab is building. And if you want to know more about the business side and how to apply these principles in creating new business, then go to reaktor.com and you can find a subpage there for business in space.
Very cool. And Reaktor is with a K, just to clarify for people, but I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, sorry about that. I seem to be a popular person today.
Very popular.
Reaktor with a K.
Yes, exactly. So, Jussi, thanks a lot for your time today. It was very cool to talk to you, and very cool to see what you are doing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And of course, for the listeners, you can find the Bits vs. Bytes podcast on bitsvsbytes.com and also on Twitter, Instagram, and of course, LinkedIn. It's all Bits vs. Bytes. And I would like to thank you for listening, and until next time.